For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. For more information, visit faith.yale.edu. This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. In 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom brought 250,000 people to the Lincoln Memorial. In 1969, the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam had about 500,000. And each year since 1974, the March for Life is walked by hundreds of thousands, even up to around 650,000 in 2013. And in 2017, the day after Donald Trump's inauguration, the Women's March hit at least 3.3 million, maybe up to 5.6 million. But since May 26th, 2020, somewhere between 15 and 26 million people have entered the public square to protest the murder of George Floyd. And as these protests against police brutality and for racial justice have persisted, the political narrative is yet another symptom of U.S. polarization. The conservative take is to emphasize the violence and damage that sometimes comes along with the protests. If police don riot gear, then, well, it must be a riot. And you suppress riots with law and order. The progressive angle emphasizes the consistently peaceful demonstration against the use of violence. But when the Attorney General of the United States orders police to clear the streets for a Donald Trump Bible-holding photo op, and when unmarked vans with federal agents arrest peaceful protesters in Portland, detaining them without due process, the question of state violence against its own citizens definitely comes to mind. If we need law and order, we need a law of love and an order of peace, as Miroslav recently told Lauren Green in an interview. And we need to consider the close linkage between the use of violent force against largely peaceful protests and demonstrations and a Christian nationalist narrative that seems to be increasingly at play in the current administration, holding up Bibles, trying to defend a God who doesn't need defending. So in this episode, we're highlighting a 10-minute segment that didn't air in Miroslav Volf's interview with sociologists Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, authors of Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States.
You know, one of the areas of deep moral intuitions and conviction is how one goes about deploying violence. And David Martin, whom you will know, maybe our listeners might not, who is a famous and influential British sociologist of religion. He died just last year. He's written a smallish and somewhat disjointed book that is splendid, notwithstanding, and people don't know about it. And its title is, Does Christianity Cause War? And in it, he has an interesting account of dynamics of relation between societies and religions, which forms then the basis of his claim that religion becomes violent in certain circumstances. And he writes this: these special circumstances under which religion becomes violent, these special circumstances occur when religion becomes virtually coextensive with society and thus with the dynamics of power, violence, control, cohesion, and marking of boundaries. It seems that Christian nationalism aspires just to that.
I think what we find over and over, too, in our work in different studies is that exact point, that Christian nationalism wants to align what it sees as good for the country with positions of power to be able to enforce those things. And its, exclusivist political vision on the United States. And so as it gained access to that, then it doesn't want to lose access to it. And so it will support authoritarian measures, or will see police structures as, and those authority figures as instituted by God. And so who are we to question, what they do or how they do it? And anything that might push back on those, they would see as fearful. And so I think in this sense too, Christian nationalism is a quest for power in the political sphere, in the social sphere. And, at the beginning of our book, we kind of highlighted two quotes, one from Colossians and one from Niebuhr. But this idea from Colossians 2, where Paul's warning them, don't let anybody take you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. And so when we think of power and the role that power has in this world and whether or not that aligns with the example of Christ, as we see it, or as it kind of is highlighted, that they will take the role of power to enforce rather than another avenue that, for some looking at Christianity or the aspect of how Christ lived and walked in this world was something completely different.
Yeah, and possibly then response might be in the church and in the family. Maybe he's the meek Christ, the lamb, but in the sphere of politics, Christ is the lion, right? So that you have this sturdier Christ than what we see him actually having been. Now, connected with that, in your book, you refer to the work of Yale philosopher Jason Stanley, how fascism works, and the book is about danger of rhetoric that encourages fear and anger as a means to foment ethnic and religious divisions. And he claims that the central to fascist politics is a particular kind of fear of losing the dominant culture to religious and ethnic minorities and so forth. Is that what you are seeing in Christian nationalism? Is it susceptible to the fascist temptation? Has it almost fallen in that temptation, succumbed to it?
Yeah, Jason Stanley's work has, I think, influenced me in particular in our book tremendously, because as we have been publishing these studies for the last 5 or 6 years now, and we worked on the book, and I was thinking through the categories, or the categories that he gives for, or the steps that he gives for what fascism does and how it behaves. I started to realize that just about every study that we've published checks all the boxes of the things that he indicates. Fascism is concerned with, appointing strongmen, populist leaders. Fascism takes this distinction between the rural, real countrymen and the urban parasites. It advocates this kind of hardworking narrative that only people who are contributing to society are worth receiving human rights. It becomes obsessed with kind of sexual deviance or deviation from traditional gender roles. I mean, all of the things that we have, I think, unpacked in these studies that Christian nationalism seems to be strongly associated with, Jason Stanley identifies. And so I would not say that Christian nationalism, as we witness it, is part and parcel of some kind of full-blown fascism that America's right on the cusp of becoming a fascist state. But I would argue, and I have argued, I think in previous blog posts and conversations, that I think what we're seeing is Christian nationalism could be on the road in that direction. I think it's kind of a quasi-religious proto-fascism that eventually leads in that direction, if it were not for certain institutions that we have in place in the United States and certain checks and balances that we can use to fight back this kind of narrative. I think one of them being free speech and freedom of the press and the freedom of professors like myself to be able to write against it. But to the extent that those rights and liberties get restricted, which I think certain parties would want to do that, I think that would provide the opportunity for Christian nationalism to really, I think, gain more influence and become, I think, what Jason Stanley envisions in his book, which is really unfortunate. I think circling back to this idea of Christian nationalism's relationship to violence, because I wanted to speak in, and I think the idea of fascism also correlates with that, because I think fascist societies are certainly on board with the use of violence. I think something we've observed in our studies of Christian nationalism is Christian nationalists, because they are, as Andrew was saying, so concerned with power, I think they assume that other people are also interested in their power. They take a very what political scientist Paul Jupe calls the inverted golden rule.
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah.
I think that goes, expect from others what you would do to them if you were given the chance.
Yeah.
And so what Christian nationalists are very keen to do is to assume that there is going to be violent people in the world. There are going to be bad guys with evil intentions. And the solution isn't to turn the other cheek. The solution is to counter that bad guy violence with what I call righteous violence, good guy violence. And so that means Christian nationalists tend to be very, very much so pro-guns, pro-Second Amendment. They tend to be pro-military, pro the use of police violence. And Miroslav, you mentioned a second ago, maybe Christian nationalists are okay with being Christ-like in the family. They actually are more pro-Christian nationalism is one of the strongest predictors that you're a fan of corporal punishment in the family. And so this use of what I call good guy violence is, I think, in what you might consider a broadly authoritarian approach to social control, whether it's in the family or in society, I think is completely aligned with Christian nationalist ideology.
Mm. There is a strong and abiding Christian tradition of just war, and what I'm hearing you saying is that it's not even a kind of deployment of violence that is carefully assessed against the criteria of what might be a just deployment of violence. I myself am more in the pacifist tradition, but I understand if people, when they're concerned about the issues and they feel that violence sometimes needs to be deployed, that they want to invoke certain criteria. But even those doesn't seem to be our operative, or am I mistaken?
Some people kind of commentating on today talk about how the goalposts keep moving. And so I think those that strongly embrace Christian nationalism, they will default towards reinterpreting or re-identifying, what should have happened or should not have happened in a situation to defend or benefit those that already have power or in power and those authoritarian measures, as long as it continues to benefit them. And I think we see this in some sense in real time with Donald Trump. So if we go back a couple weeks when they cleared Lafayette Square of peaceful protesters with tear gas on U.S. citizens so that he could walk across and stand in front of the church holding a Bible. You saw some conservative evangelicals or white evangelicals say, I just don't know about that. But a lot of them were perfectly fine with it. And so, again, this kind of using violence to benefit those that have power or provide access to power, I think is right in line with that. And we'll continue to see that.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured theologian Miroslav Volf with sociologists Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edited and produced the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. We produce a new episode every Saturday, and you can subscribe through any podcast app. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I know for people who love listening to podcasts, it's precious time, and that you chose our show to listen to, it really is very meaningful to us. Since the launch of the show in April of this year, we've more than tripled our listenership each week, and we're really grateful that you are a part of that. Now, if you're enjoying our interviews, reflections, conversations with public intellectuals and theological voices and philosophical and ethical voices, we would really love your support. 3 ways to support us today would be to share the show with a friend by text or email, posting on your social feed, or opening Apple Podcasts to leave a review and a rating. We ask because it really does work, and because we want to continue to grow. We want to continue to let other people in on these conversations. So thank you for your support and for listening. We'll be back with more next week.